So my early research for the PhD was all carried out in Japan, by which time I started out actually by going to a Japanese language school in Yokohama in Japan, which was extraordinarily tough. And I had just had my first child, so it wasn't the best time in the world for me. And no, I had just had my second child, that's right. But it was a very difficult time. We had to go to the language school every day of the week, 5 days a week, and we had to start, I think it was 8:30 in the morning, and we went on right through until 4 in the afternoon, working all the time in Japanese. And there were some people in the group who were very good already, because they, not at speaking Japanese, but at reading Japanese, because they were going into Japanese literature or Japanese history, and they had to really, really, really read properly. And the one or two of us who were becoming anthropologists were perhaps not so bad, or we were getting better at speaking, which is what we really wanted to do, and we struggled and struggled with the reading. And everyone knows that it takes 10 years to read Japanese properly, right? So it was tough, and a very difficult time. And you have to commute on the busy trains every day to get to the school in Yokohama, and so on. Absolutely exhausting. But anyway, I got through that training, and then was at the point where I came back briefly to the States, and then back to do my PhD field research in Japan. And what I did at that time was research into what I came to call the East Asian medical system. And I think I mentioned this already, that the Japanese early on had a socialized healthcare system. So everybody without exception had access to decent healthcare and to basic vaccinations and public health and so on. But at the time when I went there, they were undergoing what they themselves called a boom in traditional medicine. Boomu, they call it. And it was a revival of going to acupuncturists and doctors who do herbal medicine. Doctors who do herbal medicine in Japan are MDs. They're all MDs, but they're then trained in a second major set of training in how to prescribe herbal medicines properly. And then massage is another discipline, of course, and moxibustion, burning mogza, the plant, on, I don't know what it's called in English, really. Mogza, I always call it. It's very common around everywhere, and you burn it on places where you've got pain, and you often put a slither of garlic or on there so that it doesn't actually burn the skin, but the heat gets through. And we actually started taking our children to the one of the really good Kampo doctors. Kampo is the herbal medicine doctor, and who's an MD doing herbal medicine, and he was a fantastic man who became a very close friend. And we started taking, Richard had a bit of asthma because we were sleeping on Japanese tatami, and he was getting respiratory problems. So he was made better very quickly by our doctor, Dr. Nakata. And then our son was having a bit of a problem he was very, very young, with wetting the bed. And Dr. Nakata said, "Oh, I can deal with that." And so we brought Adam in to Dr. Nakata, and he took a tiny, tiny little special silver ball, tiny, and he taped it onto the bottom of his, right down here, and he said, "That'll be fine now, that you won't have any more problems." And so we took Adam home, and sure enough, he never wet his bed again. Of course, whether it's placebo or whether it did something, we'll never know, but it sure worked. And Adam liked Dr. Nakata very much, so that was a very good arrangement. So I did a year's worth or more don't remember the details, of research in clinics both in Tokyo and in Kyoto that deal with herbal medicine, major nationally recognized clinics, very busy clinics. And then I also went to acupuncture clinics to interview there, and to places where they do massage. And I underwent all the treatments myself, of course, and spent lots of time talking to many of the practitioners and to patients quite extensively too. And the end result of that finally was that I published my first book, which was the result of the rewritten PhD called East Asian Medicine in Urban Japan. This book is still in print. It's still used in the classroom, I think, quite a lot. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't be in print at this stage. I learnt, obviously, a lot from that experience, not just learning about these different forms of treatments and different thinking, completely different thinking about the body, and also the very clever way in which these MDs are able to integrate, or they don't integrate, they use two different types of thinking depending on the person that they see in front of them and what is the problem that they're presenting. They're able to shift what's going on in their head appropriately. It isn't all a mash, it's separate, because they're using their deductive biomedical thinking, and they're using their more holistic, integrative East Asian medical thinking in a very different way. But they're able to follow these tracks very independently, and they're very articulate about these things, and they know which patients to refer. So they are not in clinics where they can do surgery, major surgery, and they're not in clinics where they can treat some major acute problem. So they instantly send those patients to the hospital and say, this is where you belong, you shouldn't be with us. And so their specialty really is chronic conditions of various kinds. So they deal with the asthmas and the pain of all kinds, and with gastrointestinal chronic problems and things like that. But they don't deal with infectious disease or chronic viral stuff. They send people to the regular doctor. They're absolutely meticulous about that. And they're recognized by the government, and so are the acupuncture clinics. They're all formally recognized, and everybody has to go through a formal training and get proper licenses. So there's no quackery about this. Of course, at some places in distant mountains there's quackery, but most of it is what you yourself would feel comfortable going to. But what I learned right away from that early research was that I was dealing with a society where something that I came to call and write about is very important, the idea of sociocymatics. In other words, illnesses are not psychologized in Japan or in China much, for that matter, or Korea. Maybe not to the same extent in Southeast Asia either. What I learned very quickly is that the idea of psychosomatic illness is not widely recognized. It is more so today, but when I was doing my research, it wasn't. Psychiatry there were people training in Germany to be psychiatrists from the early days, but they had a tough time back in their own country. People would not go to psychiatrists. In hospitals, they would see them because they had to, but people didn't consult with psychiatrists because the orientation is one of family and of being part of a social unit. That's the primary orientation. It's not a country where individuals are prioritized, the same for all of East Asia. And this immediately becomes apparent in the healthcare system, in the way in which people think about their bodies. So the understanding in the minds of patients and of the doctors is that it must be the working life or the family relationships that are causing difficulties here. It's nothing to do with being an individual or your psyche that is doing this. So something that I came to call SocioCymatics is at work all the time. And so what this means is that, for example, when you have something that's a problem still today of children who refuse to go to school, there's quite a surprisingly large number of young children, particularly boys, who absolutely refuse to go to school, particularly when they're adolescents. And it's a very complex story, but what happens is that the school system tells the mother that the boy isn't going to school. She knows perfectly well he's not going to school because he's upstairs in his bedroom and won't come out of his bedroom. But there's a kind of complicit understanding between the school people and the mother that this child needs somehow to be left shut away for the time being. And she will give the child, she'll feed the child, of course, and beg him to come out and beg him to talk and beg him to go to school, but he won't do it. And this has become a really chronic problem. It's written about widely in Japanese newspapers, and I did some research on this. And some girls are involved too, but it's by far more common among the boys. And the way in which this is handled is not through psychiatrists. It's handled through counselors who are not necessarily psychiatrists at all. And it's supposed to always be family therapy, and father's supposed to come as well, but he usually claims he's too busy, or very often claims he's too busy. And very often these boys do in the end get back into school, but more recently it's extended to something which in Japanese is called hikikomori, and this literally means being stuck away, hidden away inside your house, not moving. And this now includes young people who are not getting into the workforce or have been let go because Japan's been in recession for a good long time. And they're very, very reluctant to let people go, but this has been happening. So there's more and more of this. It's a problem that's been going on and on and on in Japan, and is of local concern, enormous concern. And there have been other anthropologists who've written about this more recently. Very, very interesting subject. But again, it's still this same approach, which is one of dealing with it as a social matter. And when you ask what are the origins of this problem, do you think, the answer will almost always be, oh, it's either the family isn't functioning well. It's not the child's personal problem. It's the family isn't functioning well. The father's drinking too much, or the mother's lazy, or something like this. Or else, more likely, that the school is stressing the child far too much, and the child is being teased for one reason or another. So actually vulnerable children sometimes are kids who've been taken abroad because their father is working in Europe or America or something. The kid's been taken abroad, had 1 or 2 years in a foreign school, comes back and is regarded as an outsider in Japan, and maybe their Japanese is not up to scratch. And they start to be teased, and it's a very, very unpleasant situation. But the explanation is always social. always that there's something wrong with the society, and some of the people who critique this in Japanese say that in a way this sort of situation is perhaps natural in a society where we put so much pressure on our kids. And when you live in Japan, you get a glimpse of this pressure. I mean, I had children in school in Japan, but you also see little kids traveling by themselves on the train for miles and miles to get to special schools that the parents want the child in to make sure he will get to a special university. So this kid can be commuting for an hour or two on a train, both ways, and he can be a tiny child. And he's falling asleep and he misses his station, and everybody on the train tries to help to get him to the right station and so on. It's really quite a shocking sight. So very much a social matter. But I certainly learned that this is a society where the social origins of ill health are very, very, very well appreciated, rather than psychologizing the origins of conditions. So another book that I wrote is called Health, Illness and Medical Care in Japan, and I co-authored it. Ed Norbeck is the senior author there. This has a beautiful cover, and this is actually an edited book with many authors who are all specialists in healthcare in one kind or another in Japan. And I'm not sure whether that book is still in print, but it certainly was well used at a particular time. So I think this is where my long-term interests, which exist to the present day, about embodiment started to develop. Becoming keenly appreciative of the way in which, as anthropologists, we really have to understand that embodiment is a means of linking what the mind with the body. It is something which is present everywhere in the world, but it's something that we as anthropologists have not done justification to, because so many anthropologists have spent a long time black boxing the body. And we've handed the body over to biologists and to physical anthropologists as though it's a scientific matter and it's nothing to do with us. And we've followed Kroeber. We've followed the path of Alfred Kroeber. And we focus on the mind, which we call culture. Boas developed the concept of culture, of course, but Boas was always ambivalent, and Boas kept both pathways firmly in his head and remained to his death concerned with both mind and body in various ways, with both nature and nurture. And as George Stocking said, he probably never resolved in his own mind which was more important, if either. But then we move to Kroeber, who takes it, of course, right away and says biology is nothing to do with us, and we are cultural anthropologists, or in Europe, social anthropologists, and we don't deal with the body at all. And I believe, in retrospect, that Kroeber has done us a great disservice. He needed to do it to set the field of anthropology on a firm footing in North America, in America. But I think I think we have a price to pay for having done that, and it's very, very hard to get the body back into the picture. So many anthropologists, for reasons that I partially understand, especially in North America, are very, very concerned about taking on the very idea of the body. And I think it's, in America particularly, is so tightly linked with concerns about race and racism and the assumption, and as soon as you mention the body, they think body difference. Oh, that means skin color, and that means racism. And of course, they're right. And here we are right now living with this in every country in the world, as far as we can tell. It's just burst out all over Europe and all over America, and spills over into Canada. And First Nations stuff, of course, persists unabated. And obviously, a cultural anthropologist is going to be concerned about this kind of thing, and one way to handle it is not to deal with the body and not to even think that there could possibly be biological differences, for fear that this will be mobilized by racists rather easily. And it's a danger. It's definitely a danger. But I think, as we'll see when I start talking about epigenetics later, that I think we really, really, really have to get over this. Otherwise, we're going to be in danger of compounding things in a much more complex way, which we'll talk about shortly. So one of the first books that came out, again, an edited book with a co-author, Deborah Gordon, which is the beginnings of this whole new approach to thinking about the body and thinking about biomedicine as something that needs to be examined, is called Biomedicine Examined. And we just left the title as simply as that. I remember us discussing for ages, what's the subtitle, and then finally we said, there isn't one, this is it. And it has a photograph of William Osler on the front teaching medical students in the old days. And this book, again, is a collection of essays, but these essays range from historians and sociologists and anthropologists, all making contributions, which are marvelous. I sort of went back and glanced at a few of them recently, and these are really powerful essays, and this book is still cited very, very regularly in the world of medical anthropology. And at that time, I also started doing a little bit of research back here in Montreal for the first time, and that was with Greek immigrants. Because quite a lot of early anthropology, not all of it medical anthropology, took up the concept of nerves, nervios in Spanish and nèvre in Greek, and that's used all over Europe and in Central America, which the concept coming, we think, from Europe, to express what in ordinary language these days we'd probably say stress. But of course it isn't. It is and it isn't stress. It is stress in that people have the physical symptoms of being anxious and palpitations and all of these things. So you go to a doctor and he says you've got stress, and he might even try to prescribe an antidepressant or something like that. But nèvre in among the Greek immigrants to Montreal, whom I interviewed, meant so much more. And they could tell me great narrative accounts of, much like the Japanese had done for school refusal. They could bring in big narrative accounts about how their husband was drinking too much and he was spending all the money, and they had nothing left to buy the food for the household, or their child, who was supposed to be super at school, was not doing quite as well as she might do, or she was beginning to get a boyfriend and her father was going crazy about this, and above all about their own working conditions, because many of these people are in the garment industry in Montreal and working really, really hard. Some of them would be doing it at home, also working hard, and they were talked all the time about having nèvre. And if it was just diagnosed as stress, this just didn't help them. It helped them to be able to conceptualize it as nèvre and all the ramifications of what that meant. So that was my foray into Montreal and getting to know a little bit about immigrant life in Montreal. So just to mention 3 more books that came out, edited books that came out pretty early. This one is Knowledge, Power and Practice, The Anthropology of Medicine and Everyday Life, and this is co-edited with Shirley Lindenbaum. And this came out in 1993, and it was the result of a Wenegren conference that took place in Cascais in Portugal. And this book, above all else, I believe, set the foundations for a critical medical anthropology. It was an incredible conference. People talked about things like the concept of risk. They talked about the double standards of treatment evaluation. Alan Young talked about PTSD for the first time, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the subtitle, How Ideology Shapes Knowledge Production. And other people who were there was Jean Komarov, who works in South Africa. She wrote about the diseased heart of Africa, medicine, colonialism, and the black body, so the beginnings of colonial and post-colonial writings here. And Donna Haraway, who wrote The Biopolitics of Postmodern Bodies, Determinations of Self in Immune System Discourse, right? This, I believe, is a key book. It's still in print and it's still used in teaching. It really set the stage for a critical medical anthropology. And then the book called Social Suffering, edited by Arthur Kleinman and Veena Das and myself, came out in 1977. This is also a co-edited book, and this was a result from a conference at the Rockefeller Foundation Center in Bellagio in Italy, which is an absolutely stunning place to have a conference. I have sort of dissociated myself from this work somewhat because I think there's a tendency to depoliticize and to stay too much at a kind of level of psychologization and suffering in a lot of, not in necessarily in these essays, but that's where that whole world of social suffering has moved to. So I don't regard myself as part of that any longer. And then finally, among the early books is this really interesting book, which New Horizons in Medical Anthropology. This was the Festschrift for essays in honor of Charles Leslie, co-edited with Mark Nakata. And this too has essays from all sorts of contributions from anthropologists and historians. And this book focuses on Charles Leslie's specialty, which was medical pluralism, the way in which biomedicine comes in all over the world, but it never replaces indigenous medical systems. Wherever you go today, indigenous medical systems survive in one form or another, and the vast majority of people will, of patients or potential patients, will consult with different kinds of health practitioners. So even here in Canada, we don't just go to our GP or our family doc, we go to the acupuncturist, we go to the chiropractor, and some of us take all sorts of weird medicines, not me, but some people do. And homeopathy I don't happen to believe in at all. But we do it, and everybody all over the world does it too. And of course they do it especially in places where the biomedical system is lacking, or you have to walk 2 days to get to it, and so on. So he really set the whole idea of medical pluralism on the map, and generated he had many students, and generated a huge amount of good research about the complexity that we as anthropologists are dealing with when we take on healthcare systems globally.